Hi there, and welcome to the pod. Welcome back if you're returning, and hello if it's your first time. We've been talking about very different things each episode, and today it's going to be story time. I thought you might enjoy some stories about record making and how to build a career in music if you're an engineer or producer. And like a lot of people, I started at the very bottom. It was always my dream to become a record producer, and I kind of got the skills together as far as engineering goes, but I hadn't got any production credits yet. So I did what any ambitious person would do, and that was create my own opportunity. I'd found a band who were pretty amazing. This is going back a few years, and at the time in the UK, there was quite a big scene, which was half hippie, half drugs. What a surprise. And music was a huge part of that scene, whether it was warehouse raves or kind of psychedelic influenced jam bands. Well, I came across a band who were absolutely fantastic. And their thing is they were basically playing kind of dance music, except with real instruments. We had worked together a little bit before, so I recorded a live show of theirs. An absolute nightmare, I must say. Having to cart a full mixing desk, big analog mixing desk, and a tape machine, and all of the other stuff up 2 flights of stairs in the Trade Union Club in Reading to record this performance. It turned out pretty well. It's actually on Spotify now, if you ever wanted to check it out. And also recorded another demo for these guys. Again, which turned out pretty well. So at some point, I approached them and said, hey, it's time you guys made a real record, and I want to produce it with you. And they said, yeah, we got along super well, and the things we'd been doing together had been turning out great. But at that point, I had a small commercial studio, and I didn't have a ton of money. It's tough to keep a commercial studio running at the best of times. It's even harder to keep a small commercial studio running. So didn't really have a lot of money. They were kind of part of this very alternative, traveler-y, very hippie-ish kind of scene. So naturally, most of them didn't work or whatever, didn't have a lot of money. So the first problem to solve was find some money. Now, there was a super nice guy who I was friends with who was kind of really early to the party when it came to making very obscure DIY records and putting them out. And he'd made his own record. I think it was called The Clan of the Cave Bear. A lovely guy called Paul Smith. And Paul was one of the more intelligent people in the world in the sense that he was a computer genius contractor guy and actually had a real job and made pretty good money, which enabled him to make super weird, heavy music. He was also a very cool and approachable guy. He was also a very cool and approachable guy, and I kind of told him of the idea I had about the record I wanted to make for this band, and he offered to front the money. Now, we kind of figured out what we would need, and it wasn't a lot of money. It was about £4,000. How was it so low? Well, I wasn't asking for any money whatsoever up front, which was absolutely foolish on my part. But I was young, I was idealistic, and I was chasing that first production credit. So, did a deal with Paul, said, hey, look, if you lend us $4,000, and I know this is risky, we'll go ahead and give you $5,000 back once we've sold some records. So, he made what I consider to be a pretty reasonable return, considering the high risk of putting money into some stupid record project. So anyway, he lent us the money. The guys came up with a plan to rent a cottage in fairly rural North Wales. I don't know where they found it, but sure enough, they found this house in the middle of nowhere, which was big enough for everyone to sleep, and it was big enough to record in. So at some point, we went shopping, bought a load of food, got in their van they'd been using for touring, and spent about 5 or 6 hours getting to this remote place in Wales called, excuse me, Welsh people, if I pronounce this wrong, Ystbyty Ystwyth, which is somewhere on a road to Aberystwyth. So we get there, and the cottage is pretty great. It's basically made of stone and tile. So there's a great big main room. Everything else comes off of that. Very high ceilings, and the drums sounded fantastic in there. I ran a snake up to one of the bedrooms, set up a little control room up there. I had, the desk on a stand. I had some monitors I brought with me. I had ADATs at that point, which were, relatively portable. I had them kind of daisy-chained and synced together. And we started to record. Now, this band was very jammy. And the idea was basically to come up with a lot of ideas. During the week, we were at the house, record them, and then we would then refine them later at the studio. That started, and on the second morning, the cops arrived because the local post office had been robbed. And of course, we were strangers. So the first person they thought had obviously robbed the post office was the strangers who arrived in the village. Well, it wasn't us, and eventually they left us alone. And they figured out that, no, these hippies aren't robbing anybody. So we kept recording for the next couple of days, and then the boys discovered that the fields surrounding this cottage were in fact covered entirely in magic mushrooms. So that kind of derailed the process a little tiny bit, and it got pretty weird and strange for the rest of the week. And there were some musical experiments, and we ended up with tapes and tapes and tapes of recordings to then sift through when we got home. Luckily, we all survived Wales and made it back. Then we spent probably a good couple of weeks, I guess. I made some roughs of all the random material that we'd recorded, and unfortunately, it wasn't quite as fruitful as it could have been. Being in a field in Wales, being on magic mushrooms 24 hours a day for a week isn't as productive as it could be. But we did have some stuff, luckily, which was very good. And all of the drums we needed were recorded. So we set about then, working on the rest of the record in my studio, fleshing it out, putting on the rest of the guitars, the overdubs, and building something which actually turned into quite a great little record. So, did some mixes, usually did maybe just a couple of mixes of each song, and it all went pretty quick by today's standards. There wasn't really a culture of massive revisions in those days because it was a hassle. You had to go back and set up the desk and all of the outboard specifically for each song, which meant you had to take lots of notes, and it wasn't necessarily easy to get back. So anyway, we ended up with a finished record. We had also found a CD manufacturer who also had a mastering studio, and it was one of the first times I actually went to a real mastering studio. Went up to somewhere in Cambridgeshire, and they had a mastering studio within the warehouse where they had the CD place. At the time it was all digital. There was no analog gear at all. It was a TC Electronics kind of mainframe and some kind of proprietary Sony hardware, both very expensive in their day and, good for the time. And the monitoring there was, I remember it was these huge B&Ws like they had at Abbey Road. Mastered the album and it all sounded pretty damn good. I was really, really happy with it. So we did a run, maybe 2,000 CDs. I think that was the first run. And lo and behold, in a few weeks, we had a finished product. So the next stage of proceedings was basically to now convince a distributor to take us on, because in those days, you couldn't just put your music out like you can now on Spotify or wherever. You had to have it in stores pretty much. And unless they thought they could sell the music, they sure as hell weren't going to take you on and put it in stores. It's just a waste of space on the shelf. We did get a distributor. It's in fact several distributors who thankfully were non-exclusive. One called SRD, Southern Records in the UK, who saw a market for this music to this kind of new agey, traveler, hippie-ish kind of community we were servicing, and some other small distributors in Europe who also dug this kind of music. We got about £4.50 per CD. So whenever we shipped off boxes of CDs to these companies, we got £4.50, and that was a distributor price. The distributor would then sell that onto the store for, let's say, £6.50 or £7, and then the store would sell it for whatever it ended up in retail. So that's just for argument's sake, let's say, I don't know, £10. So that's the way the money structure worked in those days. The great thing about this band is they had a fantastic live performance as well, and they had a brilliant idea they came up, which was to throw what were basically raves, so big dance parties, except of course they would pretty much headline each of the events. And this could have been a mobile thing that you took around to different places, and they had other people they worked with who did lighting and visuals and also decor. So they would take over a place like this trade union club, as glamorous as it sounds, and deck it out in huge psychedelic banners and posters and parachutes which were tie-dyed, along with cool lighting and of course a massive sound system. And it worked really well. So people loved it, and they actually came to the events. It was sold, I would say, more of as an event than even a gig, which is actually quite forward-thinking. Then about this time, I got them a meeting with a pretty heavyweight manager who had recently, well, I say recently, maybe 2 albums in, he signed to Stereophonics. So at that point, people paid attention to him. They listened to him because he'd signed what became actually, a successful British indie artist. And I had told him about this concept of the show, the live show. He loved the record, and this was the opportunity to cross into a more mainstream thing into the industry. And this is how you kind of create your opportunities when you're trying to build your own career, essentially by developing relationships with artists and trying to create opportunities and prove you can do something which is marketable if you're trying to break into the big bad record industry. Unfortunately, the guys did not get on with the idea of the music biz and were very dismissive and negative, and that unfortunately did not happen. And around the same time, we had managed to sell enough CDs through various distributors that the money started to come back. Now, we had kept, let's say, about 200, so about 10%, pretty normal at the time, CDs back for use as promo, so sending them out to magazines and reviewers, and I don't even really know if blogging was a big thing, but you get the idea. People who would review, listen to, promote in some way the album. Agents even. So we had about 1,800 to play with, and we pretty much sold all of them, which is great. So we ended up with a gross of about £8,100. It would have been less because I know that there were probably more promos given out than, the allotted 10%, which is great. So everyone's excited. And then I remind everybody that we have to pay back the guy who lent us the money. And of course, bands kind of forget. they inconveniently choose to remember things as these processes go on. And of course, I had to give back $5,000 to the man who lent us $4,000. And they felt like that was them getting ripped off. Now, I would put this another way, because what we could have done is had to cut him in as a partner, and then he would have, let's say, I don't know, a 20% chunk of everything that ever came from this project, which, as it was looking at the time, could be pretty successful. So I felt it was much more sensible to give him a defined return, and then that would be the end of the relationship financially. But of course, it put a bad taste in their mouth, and we ended up with, I guess, about $3,000 left. So we have £3,000 left between every member of the band, the manager, and me. So this was the kind of partnership, if you like. And at that point, everyone kind of decided to go their own way. There was a little bit of bad vibes at that point. Even though we'd been successful, we'd financed a record, we'd made a record, we got incredibly good press. They got tons of new gigs through agents. They got places they never would have got, and they also had a fantastic, quite critically acclaimed in the underground space record, and we're just upset that they came out of it with so little money. So I think it worked out to about, I don't know, £700 each. At no point did anybody consider that I had recorded the whole thing for free. So that's me in Wales for a week, dealing with these people who were off their face, babysitting as well as recording, and then a couple of weeks in the studio recording, and then, I don't know, another week mixing, using my facilities, my studio, my electricity, my heating and whatnot, as well as all of the admin and putting together these kind of deals. Nobody for 1 second considered that that was worth far more than what I got compensated financially. And unfortunately, the project ended in kind of bad vibes. At that point, I had other opportunities landing in my lap, and I was quite open about the whole thing and just gave them everything. Gave them the DATs, the multi-tracks, the whole thing, whatever remaining CDs there were, and then let them go ahead and get on with their lives. Now, I suppose eventually they broke up, and time heals all wounds. So this thing finally came out digitally on Spotify or something a couple of years ago. So almost 20 years after it was made. And you know what? It's still a good record today. And do I regret it? No, because on the back of the CD sleeve, I was credited as the co-producer. And that was how I got my first production credit. And then I used that record as a calling card to be able to make other records as I continued to pursue my production career. Well, that's the end of that story for today. I hope you found something interesting in it. If you have any questions about anything I discussed today, please feel free to reach out. And if you'd like to hear more stories about what I like to call rock climbing the greasy pole of the music business, you'd like to know the horror stories, I'd be more than happy to share. So thank you again, and I'll see you next time on the next episode of the pod.